The laughter hit her before the rain did. 17-year-old Grace Bennett stood beneath the flickering neon sign of a roadside diner in northern Arizona, her hands buried deep inside the pockets of a faded black motorcycle jacket that was 2 sizes too large for her. 5 leather-clad bikers had just stepped outside, and the moment they saw her, their laughter echoed across the wet parking lot. They pointed at the jacket, at its torn sleeves and mismatched patches, joking that a skinny teenage girl had no business wearing something that looked like it belonged to a 100-mile-an-hour outlaw. Grace lowered her eyes and said nothing. But then one of the bikers noticed the small patch sewn onto the back of her jacket. His smile disappeared. The others followed his gaze. And within seconds, the laughter stopped so completely that the only sound left was the rain striking the pavement. If you believe that kindness can change someone's life, that people deserve second chances, and that we should never judge someone by what they wear, take a moment to like this story, share it with someone who needs to hear it, leave a comment, and subscribe to the channel for more stories about courage, compassion, and unexpected second chances. Grace had learned long ago that silence was sometimes safer than explaining herself. At 17, she had already discovered that people could decide who you were in less than 10 seconds. They saw her worn boots and assumed she was trouble. They saw the oversized motorcycle jacket and assumed she was pretending to be tough. They saw the cheap backpack hanging from one shoulder and assumed she was another reckless teenager running away from home. Nobody saw the sleepless nights, the unpaid bills, the empty refrigerator, or the reason that jacket had become the most precious thing she owned. That evening, Grace had been walking along Route 66 outside a small Arizona town after her old pickup truck had finally died 3 miles from the diner. The engine had coughed twice, shuddered violently, and gone silent. She had tried everything she knew, but the truck would not start again. She had no money for a tow truck, and her phone battery was almost dead. So she had grabbed her backpack, pulled the old motorcycle jacket around herself, and started walking through the rain. The jacket had belonged to her father. Her father, Samuel Bennett, had been a mechanic and volunteer firefighter. He had never been rich, never owned a fancy home, and never cared much about impressing anyone. But he had possessed one quality Grace admired more than anything else. Whenever someone needed help, he went. It did not matter if it was a stranger with a flat tire, an elderly neighbor whose furnace stopped working, or a frightened child caught in a storm. Samuel always believed that showing up for someone was one of the purest forms of love. 3 years earlier, he had died while responding to a highway accident during a violent winter storm in Colorado. Grace still remembered the last morning she had seen him. He had stood in the kitchen wearing his work boots and that same black motorcycle jacket, drinking coffee while snow tapped against the window. Before leaving, he had hugged her and told her to remember something simple. Courage was not about being fearless. Courage was doing what was right even when you were afraid. Grace had carried those words ever since. After her father's death, everything changed. Her mother, Rebecca, had struggled to keep the family together, but medical bills and debt eventually forced them to sell their home. Rebecca moved to another state for work, while Grace stayed with her aunt and finished high school. It had not been an easy arrangement. Her aunt had 3 young children, worked long hours, and could barely afford the household expenses. Grace tried not to become another burden. She worked after school at a grocery store, saved every dollar she could, and learned to repair old engines by watching videos and studying her father's worn-out mechanic manuals. The motorcycle jacket was one of the few things she had refused to sell. That was why she wore it even when people laughed. As Grace stepped toward the diner, she hoped nobody would notice her. But 5 bikers were gathered near the entrance. Their motorcycles stood under the diner lights, enormous chrome machines shining beneath the rain. They were members of a riding club called the Desert Saints, and most of them looked intimidating enough to make strangers cross the street. Their leader was a broad-shouldered man named Marcus Hale, with a gray beard and a scar running along his left eyebrow. Beside him stood Owen, Patrick, Calvin, and Jonah. They had been riding together for more than 20 years and were known around the region for charity rides, although Grace knew nothing about that. She only knew that they were laughing at her. One of them called attention to her jacket, making a joke about how she looked like a child who had stolen her father's clothes. Another laughed at the loose sleeves and faded stitching. Grace tried to walk past them, but her wet boot slipped slightly on the pavement. She caught herself and kept moving. Then Marcus noticed the patch. It was small, old, and partly covered by the jacket's weathered leather. It showed a silver firefighter's helmet above a simple number, 27. Marcus froze. Owen stopped laughing. Patrick stared at the patch as though he had just seen a ghost. Marcus stepped closer, his face suddenly pale. He asked Grace where she had gotten the jacket. Grace hesitated, unsure why this intimidating stranger suddenly cared. She quietly explained that it had belonged to her father. Marcus looked at the patch again. Then he asked her father's name. When Grace answered, Marcus removed his gloves. Samuel Bennett. For a moment, Marcus could not speak. He looked at the other bikers, and something passed silently between them. These men had spent decades riding together, and they had seen enough tragedy to recognize when a name carried weight. Marcus finally told Grace that her father had once saved his life. Not in a dramatic movie like Rescue, but in the kind of ordinary moment that people often forget until years later. For years before Samuel died, Marcus had been riding through New Mexico when a truck crossed into his lane. The collision threw him from his motorcycle and left him trapped beneath a damaged guardrail. His leg was badly injured, and he was losing blood. Samuel had been one of the first firefighters to arrive. He had crawled beneath the twisted metal while fuel leaked around them. He had ignored the danger, freed Marcus, stopped the bleeding, and stayed beside him until the ambulance arrived. Marcus had never forgotten him. He had even attended Samuel's funeral. But Grace had never known. She stood in the rain, stunned, while the man who had laughed at her jacket only moments earlier struggled to hide tears in his eyes. Marcus asked why she was alone. Grace explained that her truck had broken down and that she had been walking to find somewhere to charge her phone. She admitted she had only a few dollars in her wallet and had been trying to get to a friend's house before dark. Marcus looked toward the highway. Then he looked at the jacket again. He understood immediately. Grace had not been wearing her father's jacket to look tough. She was wearing it because it was the closest thing she had left to him. The bikers became quiet. The same men who had been joking moments earlier suddenly seemed ashamed. Owen took off his own rainproof riding jacket and offered it to Grace. Patrick went inside the diner and ordered her a hot meal. Calvin brought her a dry towel, while Jonah walked toward the road to see whether Grace's truck was visible from the hill. But Marcus did something that Grace would remember for the rest of her life. He knelt beside her. He told her that her father had once told him that the measure of a person was not how powerful they looked when everyone was watching, but what they did when nobody was. Grace finally began to cry. She had been holding everything inside for 3 years. She cried for her father. She cried for her mother. She cried for the house they had lost, the childhood that had disappeared too quickly, and all the nights she had pretended she was stronger than she really was. Marcus did not tell her to stop crying. He simply stayed there. That night, the Desert Saints did not leave Grace alone beside a broken truck. They called a mechanic, paid for the repair, and made sure she had somewhere safe to sleep. But the story did not end with a free repair or a warm meal. The next morning, Marcus visited Grace's school. He spoke with the principal and learned that Grace was an exceptional student who had been struggling financially. She had dreamed of becoming an automotive engineer but had convinced herself that college was impossible. Marcus disagreed. The Desert Saints had a small scholarship fund created in memory of writers and first responders who had died helping others. They had never considered giving it to someone as young as Grace, because the fund was usually used for families of firefighters and veterans. But Marcus knew Grace belonged in that conversation. He gathered the members together, and they voted unanimously to help. Over the next year, something remarkable happened. Grace's life began to change. Not because someone handed her a perfect future, but because people finally gave her the opportunity to build one. The bikers helped repair her pickup. They taught her basic motorcycle maintenance. Marcus introduced her to a local engineering professor. Patrick helped her prepare scholarship applications. Owen showed her how to rebuild an old engine without wasting money on unnecessary parts. Grace worked harder than anyone expected. She graduated near the top of her class. And on the day she received her college acceptance letter, she drove to the same diner where everything had started. The Desert Saints were waiting outside. This time, nobody laughed at her jacket. Grace had cleaned it, repaired the torn sleeve, and carefully stitched the old patch back into place. She still wore it whenever she needed courage. Marcus looked at the patch and smiled. Grace told him she had almost removed it once because she was tired of people judging her. Marcus told her she should never remove something that reminded her who she came from. Years later, Grace became an automotive engineer specializing in emergency vehicles. She helped design safer rescue trucks and equipment for firefighters. She never forgot the people who had helped her when she was 17 and scared. Every year, she returned to that diner. And every year, the Desert Saints rode there with her. Eventually, Grace became an honorary member of the club, though she never owned a motorcycle. She said she had already learned the most important lesson they could teach her. You do not have to look powerful to carry strength. Sometimes strength looks like a teenage girl walking through the rain in an oversized jacket. Sometimes courage looks like asking for help. And sometimes kindness begins when someone finally stops laughing long enough to look at the person underneath the pain. One evening, many years after that first encounter, Grace stood beside Marcus at a memorial for fallen firefighters. She wore her father's jacket, now carefully preserved. Marcus looked at the patch one more time. Number 27. He smiled sadly and told Grace that her father had saved more lives than either of them would ever know. Grace touched the patch with trembling fingers. She realized then that the jacket had never really been about keeping warm. It had been carrying her father's memory through every difficult mile. And perhaps that was why the bikers had gone silent. They had not seen a silly teenage girl wearing an oversized jacket. They had seen the daughter of a man who had once risked everything to save a stranger. A man who had taught his daughter that courage was not about being fearless. It was about doing what was right, even when you were afraid. If this story touched your heart, please like the video, share it with someone who needs a reminder that kindness still matters, and subscribe to the channel. Sometimes one small act of compassion can become the turning point in someone's entire life. And before we end, I want to ask you something special. Comment, kindness never goes unnoticed, if you believe we should never judge someone by their appearance, because we never truly know what battle they're fighting. Grace eventually stopped wearing the jacket every day, but she never stopped carrying what it represented. Her father had left her no fortune, no mansion, and no collection of expensive possessions. He had left her something far more valuable. A lesson, a legacy, and a reminder that even in the darkest moments, one person choosing kindness can become a light bright enough to guide someone home. And sometimes, all it takes to change a life is for someone to stop laughing, look a little closer, and finally see the human heart beneath the worn-out jacket.